In this presentation, we will review the separation of powers and checks and balances of the national government. You will notice that there are colors throughout this presentation. If it is colored on the screen, it should be colored on your notes. And I would actually suggest that you use the colors that I have done on the screen. And there's a reason we are using the colors, because it helps us signify what branch is being checked. So there's a reason the framers created the separation of powers. It was because they didn't want one person or branch or a majority of people to have what's called absolute rule. They didn't want a tyrant. They didn't want someone who was going to control everything. So what they did was they created 3 separate branches of government, which is known as separation of powers. The legislative branch is found in Article 1 of the Constitution. The executive branch is found in Article 2 of the Constitution, and the judicial branch is found in Article 3 of the Constitution. So, just as a review, this part is actually not even written in your notes. The legislative branch is made up of Congress. Congress includes the Senate and the House of Representatives. And if you remember, this makes them a bicameral legislature because there are 2 houses. The executive branch includes the president and vice president, and then it includes the executive departments, which include the cabinet, the federal and regulatory agencies. And then you have the judicial branch, which is made up of the federal courts, and that does include the Supreme Court. And I said you should have it color-coded, but you do not have to have this part color-coded. So let's just talk about their separate powers. The legislative branch, and this is not limited to these powers. These are just the specific ones we are going to focus on in this presentation. The legislative branch can override the presidential veto by 2/3 vote. So if the president vetoes a bill that they pass, they can override it if they get 2/3 vote. The legislative can impeach the president if he is accused of wrongdoing. They can also impeach federal judges. And lastly, the legislative branch can approve or reject appointments that are made by the president. The executive branch can propose ideas for legislation. He can prepare an annual budget, which is every year. He can call Congress to a special session if they're not meeting and something needs to happen. He can veto legislation. And lastly, he can nominate justices or judges to the federal court system. The judicial branch can declare executive actions unconstitutional, and they can also declare laws unconstitutional. So if the president does something that goes against the Constitution, like declaring war, or if Congress makes a law that goes against the Constitution, both of those things would be declared unconstitutional and they would become void. But the framers actually did not stop at separation of powers. A lot of the powers that were given to each of the branches were given to them for a specific reason. And basically what happens is a power of one branch will be over another branch. And so this makes sure that the branches do not overstep their boundaries. So it's a limited government. So each branch's separate powers allow them to check the other branches so that the powers remain balanced. So in other words, not one single branch is more powerful than the other, hence checks and balances. So not only are we going to look at the legislative powers again, but we're actually going to look at when the legislative branch does a certain thing, what branch are they checking? So when the legislative branch overrides the presidential veto, they are checking the executive branch. So that's why we have presidential in blue. When the legislative branch impeaches the president, they are checking the executive branch. And when they're impeaching a federal judge, they are checking the judicial branch. When the legislative branch approves or rejects appointments made by the president, so if he appoints a cabinet member and Congress approves that cabinet member, then they are checking the president. So you can see that each one of those things that the legislative branch does limits the other two branches as to what they can do. So When the executive branch proposes ideas for legislation, this is a check over Congress. So it's a check over the legislative branch, so that's why it's in green. When the president prepares an annual budget, that is an executive check over Congress. So they are checking the legislative branch. That's why it's green. When the executive branch calls Congress to special session, they are checking the legislative branch. So they are limiting the power of the legislative branch. When the president vetoes legislation, once again, he is checking Congress. So he is checking the legislative branch. When the president nominates judges, he is checking the judicial branch. So as you can see, when the president does these things, he is limiting the power of the other branches. When the judicial branch declares executive actions unconstitutional, that's over the executive branch. That's why it's blue. When the judicial branch declares laws unconstitutional, that's over the legislative branch. So that's why it's green. So when the judicial branch does these two things, it is limiting the powers of the other branches. So let's finish up with two questions. Which branch is most powerful? The answer here is that neither of them are. It's a trick question. And why did the framers believe a separation of powers was so important? To make sure that absolute rule didn't happen, to make sure that one person or group of people didn't have too much power.